Good evening, everyone. The Special Education Alliance is excited to bring you our speaker tonight, Dr. Al Condeluci. Dr. Condeluci has been a leader in community building, human services, and inclusive advocacy work for the past 50 years. Holding a PhD and MSW from the University of Pittsburgh, hail to Pitt, Dr. Condeluci served as the CEO of CLASS, which stands for Community Living and Support Services, a major nonprofit community building organization in Pittsburgh. And he served as that from 1973 to 2019. He holds faculty status at the University of Pittsburgh in the Schools of Social Work and Health Rehab Services, and is author of 7 books, including the acclaimed Interdependence, The Route to Community, and Social Capital, The Key to Macro Change. In 2018, he received the key to Pittsburgh, to the city of Pittsburgh, the highest civilian honor that can be given to a community member. He serves as a consultant, advisor, and human service coach, and is on a number of nonprofit boards and government commissions on a state, local, and national level. If you attended the PA Inclusion Series with Dan Habib this past February, and I hope you did, it was a phenomenal series, you may have heard Dan mention Dr. Condeluci's work. The Special Education Alliance is thrilled to welcome him today to speak on the importance of relationships in building a more inclusive school community. I'm confident that the lessons we learned today will inspire ideas on how we can take an actionable role in building more inclusive communities within the school environment, and I'm sure those lessons will also transfer to the broader community as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Al Condeluci.
Thank you very much, Ramona. Thanks so much for that kind introduction, and also the opportunity to be with you and your colleagues and other guests that are signed on to our session tonight. So happy and so humbled to have a chance to share some ideas and to be with you. And the topic we're going to be focusing in on is one that everyone on this call is aware of and has been working towards, right? And in fact, when you were giving my profile and talking about my experience going back in a formal way, some 52 years, but really my experience as an advocate for disability tracks all the way back to my childhood. I live in Pittsburgh, only about 5-6 miles from the center city, but in a little community called McKees Rocks. And it's an ethnic blue collar town. And my grandfather moved from Italy to McKees Rocks as a young man looking for opportunity, right? Like most immigrants that came to the United States from the European countries. And he found his way to Pittsburgh primarily because he had a cousin who lived in Pittsburgh. And his cousin had been writing him letters telling him that he should leave Italy, the little town of Fagnana Castello in southern Italy, down in if you look at a map of Italy, the heel and the boot of Italy. Well, Calabria is where the heel is, and Fagnana Castello, the town that my grandpa hailed from, is down close to the Strait of Messina and Sicily. And so he made his way to the United States and came through Ellis Island and, boarded a train, got to Pittsburgh, where he met his cousin, who began to introduce him to a new culture, to a new world, right? And my grandfather's cousin, his name was Guido, functioned essentially as his gatekeeper, right? And that's a concept I'm going to talk a little bit more about later in our content for today. But Guido introduced my grandfather to a new culture, kind of a new world. My grandfather didn't know the language. He didn't know the customs. He was not sophisticated in any way, shape, or form. And Guido did that. He got him tied into a church. He got him tied into a community where my grandfather could live, and he got him a job in the steel mill of Pittsburgh, shoveling coal into the blast furnaces, and so my grandfather began to make his way in a new country, in a new place, right? And so he ended up renting a home on a hillside where he started his family. And at the top of the hill, right above where my grandfather was living, was just a wide open, field. And so my grandfather approached the owner of the property to find out if he could keep a garden and some goats on the property. And so a deal was cut with the owner of the property that Grandpa could keep a garden and goats, as long as he made sure that the owner got some of the tomatoes and zucchini and scallions that were grown in the garden, as well as the goat milk and goat cheese that Grandpa was able to harvest. And so, along with his work in the steel mill, every night he would go up onto the hilltop. He would bring his children, my dad being one of them, up to the hilltop, and they would take care of the garden. They would take care of the goats, and being on this hill became almost like a special place. And so when my dad and his brothers and sisters got old enough, they thought, we should buy some property on the hilltop and build our homes there, right? So they approached Dr. Harrington, the owner of the property, and they made a deal for 4 or 5 acres at the top of the hill, and they bought the land. And there was no banks, there was no mortgage. It was just a straight out deal where they would pay Dr. Harrington, money every month toward the ownership of the property. So the first thing they did when they bought the hilltop was to build a home for Grandpa and for my grandma and grandpa, right near the goat shed. And then they built homes for each other. So when I was born in 1948, there were 8 Condeluci families who lived up on this hill. And it was really kind of a paradise, right? It was an enclave, if you will, where, everybody's related and everybody, watched out for each other. And so when I was growing up in this little Condeluci Hill enclave where 8 families lived, 8 Condeluci families, my closest friend was my cousin Carrie, who was born the same year I was. And we were sort of like bosom buddies, right? We were always together, how cousins are in big extended families. And we did everything together, Carrie and I. But one of the things that happened as we came of school age was I went to school, but Carrie didn't go to school. Okay? And even though we were the same age, and so I would go to school with my cousins who were all in school, and we would come home at lunchtime, and there was Carrie. She would be playing up on the hill, and we would play a little bit at lunchtime, and then we would go back to school. Carrie would stay back. And I was curious about that. After a couple of weeks, I asked my mom, I said, Mama, how come Carrie doesn't go to school with us? And my mom says, well, honey, Carrie really can't learn. And I said, what? I said, what do you mean Carrie can't learn? She knows everything that we know. She plays all the games, hide and seek, all the stuff we do in the evenings. And my mom said, well, Carrie can learn, but she just learns differently. And the schools don't know how to teach her because she has a thing called Down syndrome. Right? And I said, you mean to tell me, Mama, if you have Down syndrome, you don't have to go to school? Right? And my mom says, yeah, that schools just don't know how to teach kids with Down syndrome. I said, Mom, can I catch Down syndrome from Carrie so I don't have to go to school either? Right? That innocent sort of notion about not wanting to, go to school. Right? But it was a really powerful lesson for me as a youngster about who's welcomed and who's not welcomed in the elements of our community, right? School being one of the most important elements of our community. And as we got a little bit older and we started to participate in community events, my cousins and I, Carrie would come with us to those things, street fairs, football games on Friday night, the kinds of things that you do in community generally, right? Festivals. Carrie would come with us. And my mom would always tell me as we were leaving the hill to go to a festival or go to a game, Mom would say, make sure Carrie's okay, keep an eye on her, make sure everything's all right. So we would go down off the hill to a game or to a festival. And I learned a second lesson about being welcomed and not being welcomed by the way people treated Carrie. And, in some ways, people were just incredibly mean and mean-spirited, made fun of Carrie, played jokes on her, taunted her. Carrie had a cleft palate that caused her speech to be affected. And although we could always understand her on Condeluci Hill, other people who didn't know Carrie couldn't understand her and consequently would make fun of her, right? And those lessons, though, that notion about who's welcomed in a formal way and also who's welcomed informally really, really affected me. And in fact, it was what got me on my life's path, right? My career path. Because as we got old enough to start figuring out what we wanted to do when we graduated from school, I always told my counselors, I want to help people like my cousin Carrie, right? And it's just not fair and it's not right how she's treated by other people. And it's not fair that she doesn't get a chance to go to school. And so my counselors, my high school counselors said, well, Al, if you want to help people with disabilities to be included, you have to go to college and you have to study. They have problems and you have to learn about their problems so you can help them. And so, I said, okay, if that's what I have to do, then that's what I'll do. And, off to college I went. And when I got to college, and I was interested in disability advocacy and disability issues, the introduction was to understand people's problems and then try to find interventions to lessen their problems so that people can find more success in community. And that paradigm, that approach to disability, by the way, is still the major way we think about disability in this country and around the world, by the way. We think about it from a problem perspective. We think about it from a diagnostic perspective. And consequently, we try to come up with interventions and approaches that are going to lessen the struggle or the challenge that we think, people with disabilities have. And the goal is really to ameliorate and to lessen or to prepare and enhance the person with the disability so that they can perform more typically in community. Right? That really is still the bottom line in disability and in rehabilitation today in America and around the world, I might add. Now, when I was in school, I thought, okay, if this is how we do it, then I want to learn about it and then really try to to do it, to try to help people become more included, right? And as I started to embrace this, and started in some formal roles in working in disability related services, I was trying these things, right? Let me give an example. My cousin Carrie, as I mentioned, had difficulty enunciating words because of the cleft palate, and my uncle and aunt, Carrie's mom and dad, were told that it would really be helpful if she got speech therapy, right? Because if Carrie could speak more clearly, people could understand her, and then it would be easier for her to be included. And that seemed to make sense, right? That notion that, okay, if somebody has a problem, they can't speak very clearly, if you can get that problem ameliorated, great. And then they can speak clearly and get on with their lives. But Carrie went to speech therapy and probably had thousands of hours over the course of her young life. And yet all that speech therapy never really resulted in her ability to speak more clearly. That clearly she wasn't able. I mean, it didn't work, so to speak. Now, that doesn't mean that speech therapy is not helpful. It can be helpful, but in this case, it really wasn't. And consequently, what really got me thinking was that not only did it not work, but when I really began to think about it, I said, all of us on Condeluci Hill, we can understand everything Carrie says. She doesn't need speech therapy to communicate with us. We understand what she's saying, right? And then it dawned on me, like, why did we understand Carrie and no one else, right? And that got me into a whole new framework of thinking and of practice related to inclusion, right? Getting people included. And that took me down a track of understanding macro change. Now, most rehabilitation effort, most habilitation efforts follow a micro track. And a micro track is quite simply, the person has a problem, the problem is in them. We got to find some ways that we can ameliorate the problem and lessen the problem so that the person can be successful, right? Take their rightful place. That's a micro focus, because all the focus is on Carrie. Carrie has got to learn to speak more clearly. That's a micro intervention technique, right? But because of the failure of micro efforts to get people included, which have been resounding failure, it's really led me down another path. And that path is really to understand macro change. And macro change is really focused not so much on fixing the person as it is on changing the environment, right? And changing attitudes and perceptions and people. So the target in macro change isn't the person with the disability. The target is everybody else, right? And it's not hard to understand macro change when you think about your own family. Those of us who are on this call tonight, I'm sure most of the people that are on the call have someone in their family with a disability, and that introduction to disability changed them. It changed how they see them. And that's macro change. Macro change is when everybody else begins to change. Now, macro, there's two routes to macro change. The first route is formal petitioning of the community, of the culture, through laws, regulations, and redress for inclusion, right? And that formal petitioning, let me give an example. My cousin Carrie didn't go to school when we were of school age because the schools didn't really have to educate her. And it wasn't until 1976, with the passage of Public Law 94-142, that literally schools, public schools, were now held accountable to educate kids with disabilities, right? Before that, before 94-142, they didn't have to, and many of them didn't, right? So that petitioning passage of a law really was designed to promote macro change, right? How do we change public education, right? Change it through laws. We can change it through formal petitioning, and not just public education, but public housing, public transportation, employment issues, the whole variety of community things can be focused in on through legal actions, right? And for example, the passage of ADA in 1990, IDEA, the whole framework of IEPs, all of that was formally petitioned and passed through laws. Now, that type of macro change is powerful, right? And when in my early days as an advocate, starting with Public Law 94-142, all the way through, things that we're doing today, that I was at today at our city council meeting to pass, laws and regulations that will be friendly and inclusive, is certainly an important strategy. However, macro, the formal creation of a law doesn't necessarily, it says schools have to, accept all kids, kids with and without disabilities, right? But it doesn't say that they have to like it or that they have to embrace, the spirit of why we would pass a law like Public Law 94-142, right? So the bottom line here is you can legislate, formal regulatory issues, but you cannot you cannot pass a law that tells people that they have to be accepting and inclusive and welcoming, right? You cannot change morality, right, through a law, right? And so as we think about macro change, how do we change a school? How do we change a school culture, right? There are some formal things that we can do and that you already have done. But the real secret, I believe, to macro change, to make an environment, whether it be a school or a community or a work site, inclusive and accepting and respecting, is through the notion of social capital, right? Is through relationships. Relationships change attitudes. Relationships change perceptions. Relationships dispel stereotypes. Relationships do that. And so what I want to talk about tonight with you is not so much the formal things, although I will speak to IEPs and some of the ways that we might be able to utilize some of the formal opportunities that we have for inclusion. But most of my message tonight is about relationship building, right? Now, I'll describe social capital to you, and we'll get into that in a formal way. And as Ramona said in her introduction, I'll get some of this content, started, and then, we'll do a quick pause for some questions and some reactions that you might have. As Ramona said, anything that comes to your mind, get it into the chat room, and we'll try to embrace that at the Q&A sessions that we'll have. Okay, so with that in mind, and with that introduction, that long introduction in mind, let's get into a little bit of content here. Okay. What is inclusion? We're gathered today because we want a more inclusive school at Methacton, or any other school district for that matter. So what is inclusion? And it's important to know that inclusion isn't a program, right? It's not a program. It's really a philosophy, right? It's a spirit that is embraced in the culture, right? That really is accepting, respecting, and flexible. That's really what inclusion is. It's more of a spiritual thing than it is a program. And people will often ask me, well, what was what was the program you did to try to get people included in the Pittsburgh City schools? And I'll talk about the process, but inclusion isn't a program, right? It's a philosophy. Now, inclusion is the practice and process of welcoming, valuing, empowering, supporting, acknowledging, accepting diverse, not just academic, but social learning opportunities of students of all abilities, right? And it has different realities for different children. Now, when I talk about academic and social learning, I'm gonna bifurcate that energy into understanding that we often think about education from a academic kind of perspective, and yet we know that there are 4 intelligences that people have, right? 4 intelligence, not just intellectual, academic intelligence, but there's emotional intelligence, there's physical intelligence, there's spiritual intelligence, right? And each of those intelligence manifestations, ignite at different times in different ways, right? And so from a sense of inclusion, when we think this in a more holistic way, we've got to think about it beyond the academic perspective. We get caught in a trap when we stay in that zone. And so as we move through some of this, I'll do a little bit of differentiation with this notion of social academics or social learning as we move through this. But in the end, inclusion really is the key to justice, fairness for people, right? And if you look at this image, and you get this notion that more and more diversity. I mean, schools are now struggling with all kinds of diversity realities that are out there, and we all know what's happening, in our culture. And you just have to look down at Florida and see, some of the things that are going on there as it relates to the silencing of diversity, or at least the notion of the fear that is being, promulgated around, young minds understanding the notion of diversity. But in the end, diversity is a natural part of life. I mean, diversity and difference is natural at any level, at any way, in any institution, right? Because diversity then leads to equity and inclusion lead to justice. Now, why we even gathered to talk about or think about inclusion yet again? You've probably been to hundreds of sessions live and Zoom since the pandemic that focus in on this notion of inclusion. But inclusion is absolutely fundamentally important in a lot of different ways, right? Not only creating opportunities, but beginning to allow people the opportunity to engage, and then through that engagement, facilitating more understanding of uniquenesses and similarities that we have. And it benefits everybody. I mean, that's really one of the most powerful points of inclusion. Is we often think, well, inclusion, school administrators often think, well, inclusion is really for the kids with disabilities so that they can be valued. No, inclusion is really benefiting everybody. All the kids benefit. I'm going to show you a slide that really talks about the beneficial aspects of inclusion to kids with and without disabilities. But in the end, it's just the right thing to do. I mean, it's just the right, fair, equitable thing to do. And so this notion of relationships is really at the core of inclusion in any level, by the way. Inclusion in a club or a group or association, and inclusion in a new endeavor. It's all about the relationships that set the tone, right? Now, this idea of social capital is really an intriguing one to look at, both academically as well as practically, because the broad impact of social capital, spans society, right? It actually is fundamental to so many things, and literally researchers are discovering that the lack of social capital, the narrowness of life, the isolation, the limitations that happen when people don't have social capital create health disparities and can promote crime, and bad things can happen when people are isolated, limited, and disconnected, right? And so the notion of social capital is this broader sort of element of connectivity. Now, social capital was first coined as an academic term in 1916, and actually it appeared in the literature for the first time by an educator, right, in West Virginia. His name was Hannafin, and Hannafin, who taught in a public school in West Virginia, found anecdotally that the kids graduated from his school who were more successful in their community after graduation weren't necessarily the smartest kids in the school or the highest academic achievers. What he discovered was the kids that were the most successful later, post-school, post-high school, were kids that could relate, could get along, could connect with other kids, with other people, right? And so he wrote about that, but he was smart enough to know that if he just said, well, relationships are really important to life success, or friendships are really important to life success, that people wouldn't take him seriously, that they would just say, oh yeah, nice. Relationships, yeah. Friendships, yeah, great, thanks. So what he did is he coined the term social capital, right? And what he articulated, and then what was articulated after Hannafin's initial thesis on social capital, was that our social relationships are valuable, and that's where the word capital comes in. That if you're an administrator in a school, if you have a project, you have to capitalize that project. You have to find the funding for the project, right? That's where the term capital comes in. So this term social capital was begun to utilize in order to elevate people's thinking about this concept, right? Because what it refers to is the relationships that you develop in community or school or anywhere that you find yourself, create value to you, and that value can be found in three levels that have been subsequently articulated in the literature. One is instrumental value, right? Instrumental value is when somebody does something for you that saves you money, saves you time, saves you energy, where people reciprocate with one another. I'll help you with your income taxes if you can help me build a fence around my property or whatever, I need to do. That notion of a relationship with somebody that brings value to you. But it's not just the tangible value that you get in the relationship. It's also the emotional value that you basically reap in a relationship. Emotional value is best understood in people that have your back, right? Every one of us on this call know that if we got in trouble, if whatever trouble with a little T or a big T, there's somebody you could call. There's somebody that knows you, that cares about you, that will be there for you, that will come and bail you out, that will come and pick you up, that will come and be with you in your time of need. Okay? That's emotional value. And then lastly, informational value. Right? Informational value is when your social capital, when your relationships actually tell you something or introduce you to something that actually comes back to help you, that they tell you about, I don't know, a movie or a book or a recipe, and that you use, you use the recipe or you buy the book, and it really changes you. It helps you and say, man, I'm really glad I did that, right? You would have never known to do that had it not been for the information that you got from your social capital network. Now, this notion of social capital networks is really important to understand from three levels, right? And that is, if you think about like a pizza pie, right? Just think of a pizza pie, and you look at the crust of a round pizza pie. The crust represents the furthest ring, right? And that would be the zone of acquaintanceship. So in that outer ring, these are people that you know their name, they know your name, but you don't do anything with them, right? I mean, think about on your daily routines, driving to work or whatever, or in your neighborhood, somebody, but you don't do anything with them, right? You're acquainted with them, right? So they're in your social capital network, but they're in the outer zone, the furthest zone out, right? Now, in that pizza pie, move a little bit further in, and another circle there. That's the zone of activity, right? These are the people you do things with. You go places, you do things, you go for your morning walk with your morning buddies in your neighborhood, your softball team or whatever, activities you do. These are people you engage with, right? So the engagement is a little more robust. The engagement is a little bit, stronger, right? It's more than just saying hi, driving by, a neighbor, 3 doors down the street, right? These are people that you actually know, you're talking with, you're spending time with, right? Now, go into the middle zone of the pizza. Now, this is the smallest ring, but it's the zone of covenancy. The people in this zone, it's smaller. You can see it's smaller quantitatively, but this is the zone of people that you love and trust, you're intimate with, you're bonded with these people. It's smaller, but you literally, these are people that you can count on, right? Now, go back to the pizza pie. You're thinking about the pizza pie and slice it into like, the 6 or 7 slices. Now, those slices of the pizza pie represent platforms where you build social capital, places you go, things you do, clubs, groups, associations you belong to, work that you do, the church that you go to, the synagogue that you're involved in, whatever might be for you, right? Now, on that slice of the pizza pie, there's people in the outer ring. It's bigger. These are people you know from that venue, you say hello to, but you don't do anything with them. Further into the slice of pizza, these are the people in the zone of activity. These are the people you sit with, hang out with, go have lunch with. And then in the innermost part of the slice of the pizza, the juiciest, by the way, the juiciest part are the people that you're bonded with, the people that you trust, that have your back, right? The people you can go to and tell a secret to, they're going to honor it, right? Now, the last thing, I want to say about this notion of social capital in a conceptual way is that it's not just quality of relationship, acquaintanceship, activity, covenancy. Those are qualitative terms. It's also quantitative, right? It's big. The people that you're acquainted with is a pretty big group. Now, researchers have discovered that the average number of relationships that typical people have in their life is about 150 people that you have some obligation to. These would include people in your covenancy zone and people in your activity zone. 150. Now, I know what you're doing. I know you're sitting there in your living room or wherever you're at, listening to this, and you're counting up. You're starting to think, 150, this guy's great. I don't have 150, people that I have obligations with. But I'm here to tell you, you do. And it's more than you know. And if you sat down actually and began to journal, the relationships in your life, you began to try to capture that, which I did, by the way, when I was studying this, and I read that notion of 150. And by the way, that's from the work of an anthropologist by the name of Robin Dunbar, Dunbar. And in fact, Dunbar would be somebody interesting for you to Google or go to his TED Talks. And Dunbar wrote a book called Dunbar's Numbers, where he really articulates with great research behind it. It's empirical. This notion of 150, right? And so when I read Dunbar's stuff, and this was years ago, I started to think, gee, Manise, I wonder how many people that I have in my network. So I got a notebook and I started to journal it, and I started to write down, and I did it by platforms, right? I started with my family, and then I started with my neighbors. And by the way, my neighbors are my family. I still live on Condeluci Hill. And then I, did it by work, people I know and work and I have obligation with. Then I did it, people in my church. I'm active in my church. And then I did it by, people on my, my book reading club, and people that I'm active with politically, and people that I did this and that, all these places where I hang out. And I kept on filling page after page of names of people that I really felt that I had some, if they called and asked me for a favor, that I would be inclined to do it, right? Now, this notion of 150 is really powerful, because when I read that, when I got introduced to that, my immediate reaction was, gee, I wonder how many friends, how many people are in my cousin's social capital network, or in people that we serve at our agency's social capital network, right? And so I went to the literature. I thought surely somebody had studied this, studied relationship patterns for people with disabilities. And I go to the literature and nothing, right? I go and find one article or one study. Now this was back in 2000, 2002, when I was really starting to, cut my eye teeth around social capital. And so I said, gee, nobody has really looked at this. I'm going to look at it. And so with my faculty involvement at Pitt and with colleagues around the world, we framed a study, and we looked at 250 people with disabilities, adults with disabilities. And we did it in 7 different cities around the United States, 4 cities in the US, 2 cities in Canada, and 1 city, Brisbane, in Australia, where we had collaborators. And we used a survey called the Social Capital Benchmarking Survey, which was developed at Harvard, by the way, to measure social capital, to measure relationships. Because at Harvard, probably the greatest purveyor of social capital is Robert Putnam, who is on faculty at Harvard. And he wrote an expose book in 2000 called Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone. Unbelievable book that looked at social capital patterns, not around disability, but just generically. How many, what is typical? What is the benchmark, right? And that's what Putnam has been spending his time looking at in a scholarly way. So we looked at these 250 people with disabilities. We used the social capital benchmarking survey that Putnam developed at Harvard. And we then did a qualitative follow-up where we actually interviewed the 250 people to ask them to tell us the names of people that they are connected with, that they really like, and that they have some, that they could ask a favor from. And the average number that we got in the qualitative follow-up was 25. This is for the 250 people that we interviewed. Tragic. I mean, a huge, dichotomy between these 250 people with disabilities and everybody else, right? So this notion of social capital really sets the seed for me in thinking about how do we begin to promote more social capital for our sons and daughters, whether they have a disability or not, because social capital is beneficial to everybody. Your kids without disabilities, your kids with disability, it doesn't matter. The more relationships people have, the better they do in life. That is basically the bottom line. The more relationships people have in their lives, the better they do in life. And actually, let me just say one last thing about this in a general way, and then I want to get into how we might be able to try to do this. But I don't know if any of you are familiar with blue zones. Blue zones. If you aren't, you should be. You should get familiar. You should Google blue zones. Blue zones are regions in the world, and there's only 5 of them, where people outlive the benchmark, the life expectancy benchmark, where people are happier, where people are healthier, and where people feel better about their lives than anywhere else in the world. There's only 5 of them. Okay? And there's one in the United States. It's actually in California, in Loma Linda, California. The other 4, one in Sardinia, one in Ithaca, Greece, or Icarus, Greece, one in Yokohama, and one in Nicoya, Costa Rica, right? So there are 5 of them. But what they've come to discover in these regions, sociologists, is that people who live in these regions, these small little regions, are outliving the benchmark. They're healthier, they're happier, and it doesn't have anything to do with economics, with they have more money, right? It has to do with relationships, right? With social capital. And there's other variables too, but social capital is the key variable that the blue zones speak to. So I don't know if I have to, I definitely don't have to go on and rant about this. I know that your child having more relationships would be better for him or her. I know that. You know that just in your heart. You don't have to hear me give you, research data, right? And you also know that your son and daughter, if you have a son and daughter with a disability, don't have very many friends, don't have very many social engagements or outings, that people don't call them, invite them places. You know that too. And probably last, your greatest fear, the greatest fear any parent or family member has, is what happens to my son or daughter when I'm no longer around, when I cannot play, a key role, a catalyst role. What happens, right? And that notion validates to me the importance of social capital. So how can we make this happen, right? What can we do? We know it's important, it's validated, it's viable. So what can we do about it? So I'm going to toss out a couple things, and then we're going to, we'll pause for a minute with some questions you might have about this first chunk of information, and then we'll continue on with a couple other ideas, and then we'll conclude. Okay, so the IEP, right? That this is a potential instrument that can be utilized to validate the importance of relationships. Okay. Now, obviously, the IEP, as you well know, and I'm sure you've been through IEP battles, and and probably some of those battles were painful. Maybe all those battles were painful, but the IEP really does have this broader possibilities. It stresses academic proficiencies, but it can also be used to promote social capital. You can begin to finesse parts of the IEP as it relates to social capital, right? And with the IEP, we got eligibility section and levels of academic achievement, goal selections, accommodation section. There are sections in the IEP that give you some entree to begin to examine this notion of connectedness, of potential connectedness, right? And under the goals section, any goal that relates to education, can be identified, but it must be measurable. And families can focus really on participation beyond just the academics, right? I mean, we can really begin to think about other slices in the pie of our sons or daughters, right? Other slices that can be created and available to them, right? And also, it's not there's plenty of literature and there's plenty of evidence that shows that when kids have good relationships, their academic successes follow that, right? So it's not some off the wall theory, right? It's been proven and it's shown, and any academician, worth their salt understands this, right? Now, there are benefits, right, of social capital in a general sense for all of us, for any of us, that social capital builds self-confidence, right? Because through other people is a mirror to ourselves. And with other people, we begin to get a better sense of who we are, right? but it broadens a broader sense of awareness, enhances instruction, influences both people on either side of the relationship, and establishes a modeling message. Right? Now, with that in mind, kids with disabilities obviously benefit because it broadens their friendship network. If somebody would do a study today at the Methacton school district and just measured kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities and in relationship patterns, I think it would be evident that the kids with disabilities have less friendships, right? And so for kids with disabilities, broadening that network is valuable. When you feel like you belong, you feel there's a satisfaction in that that's powerful. It broadens opportunities, right? It creates, opens doors to other kinds of things. It increases social skills from a sense of, as somebody feels that they're more valued and welcomed, then they really begin to want more of that because it feels so good, right? Increases self-esteem. But for the child without a disability, it's equally valuable, right? That's why, school districts shouldn't even, there should be an agenda for building social capital for kids in our school district, right? This should be just an ongoing agenda generally, because this notion of developing an understanding and an acceptance, compassion, a sense of tolerance, those pro-social behaviors, those ethical behaviors follow relationships. And that we know when people have relationships, they become more protective, and they're more concerned about somebody who is not as accepted. It decreases anxiety, right? And we don't know how much anxiety what a disability or somebody who is having some manifestation of a disability, the anxiety that might cause. But this sort of lets the air out of that balloon, right? Because as people get to know each other, it just becomes, well, that's just Jim. That's what happens with Jim. That's why he's flapping. He just feels he's under stress. Yeah. Increased ability to respond with confidence and understanding to peers that may look or sound or think differently, right? So the notion of setting and preparing all students for a better future, better life experiences comes through this potency of social capital. Social capital informs inclusion, right? And we know that it enhances academics, right? That it creates a more fluid sociability. It lessens bullyism and some of the taunting that happens in a school or anywhere else for that matter. So that and there's lots of evidence. This is one citation. There's so many more recent citations, but children with disabilities educated and building relationships in regular classes do better academically and socially than comparable students in non-inclusive settings. And this is now continued to be corroborated through research, so that that the bar, the academic bar, goes up, and kids do better, right? So let me pause right here, because I want to get into now some strategies, but I really feel that I want to touch base with you and to get a sense of any questions or anything that I said that may not have been clear or maybe not have been fair in your assessment. So if we can just open things up to a little bit of a conversation, and then we can come back, and I want to lay out some of these strategies and recommendations in terms of actions, and then we'll do our final Q&A to wrap up before 9 o'clock. So Ramona, what do we have in the chat room? Any questions or comments based on anything that I've said up to this point?
We have a couple. Let me get right there. We don't have a lot, but I think it's because we're all in lockstep with agreeing with you on the importance of social capital.
Of course.
And I think your next segment on getting to the how
Yes.
is going to inspire some more questions. But one of our first questions here is, let's see, what are strategies clinically proven or research to build the social capital when interest does not match, cognition level is not like peers, and communication is far beyond what peers talk about? Even for typical people, relationships get developed when people share interests binded by some social phenomenon, like maybe working together. Current way of looking at these kinds of populations, whether typical or non-typical, is always kindness, that act of doing social work, but not as a friend.
Yeah. And that's really, a valid statement that was made. But you got to start somewhere, and every voyage starts with the first oar in the water, right? And the notion of some people cognitive ability being different perhaps than some other people, or some people's physical abilities being different than some other person's physical disabilities, are not necessarily preclusive of a relationship not being able to form because there's a cognitive differential or because there's a physical differential. That's not viable. It's almost like saying, well, somebody's got to be able to talk in order to build a friendship, right? They have to be able to converse with it. And that's not true either, right? People can build friendships in other ways and through other means, right? So it's not that somebody lacks skill or lacks ability with somebody else that gets in the way of a relationship forming and forging with them. And there's been examples where folks have done some life sharing stuff where people have shared lives together with persons who really did not have the same cognitive or the same physical abilities as the person sharing their life with them, but yet through the shared life experience, through that similarity of experience, the person's connected, right? Now, there's, is there a element of kindness or do-gooderism as a part of this? And in some cases there might be, right? But to me, that you got to start somewhere, right? And you can't, you just can't say, well, like for example, we know a program or an approach like Best Buddies, right? Is which has been carried out in a lot of different places, and I know most everybody on this call is familiar with the Best Buddies program, and or the Friendship Circle, which is another kind of an approach taken mostly in the Jewish community using the Friendship Circle kind of format. And it's contrived, right? It's contrived from a sense of, okay, we recruit these folks to be best buddies, and we get them connected with these folks that don't have a buddy, and we let it go, right? And and the kids that sign up to be bus buddies may do that because they, it's a do-gooder kind of a thing, or, I'm going to get some grace points or whatever might be driving them choosing to do that. But through relationships, people change and people broaden. And even though there's a contrived nature to some of these, friendship circle, best buddy kinds of programs, there is some broadening that does happen. And there's also some value juxtaposition that happens. What I mean by that is there's a sociological theory called value juxtaposition. And in value juxtaposition, what actually happens is when you have something or someone who's valued juxtapose somebody or something that is devalued or has limited value, that when those two things are juxtaposed and put side by side, the devalued phenomena rises, right? Advertisers know this. Advertisers know that if they position a new product where nobody really has a value for that product yet, nobody knows the product, and if they position that new product with somebody who's valued in community, in society, a football player, a celebrity, whatever, right? That product or that new thing, value goes up in the eyes who see those two things juxtaposed. So the value juxtaposition of somebody who's at risk of being devalued with somebody who is valued in a school culture, in the eyes of other people who see this from afar, raise the value of that potentially devalued person, right? And this has happened in every one of our lives in some way, shape, or form. Let's just stop and think about people that and people that you value, and they do something that you would never do, right? And they do it, and it begins to raise in your mind, well, maybe that's not so bad after all, right? So the potency of social influence through value juxtaposition is another sort of piece of the puzzle. But let's take one more question or comment, Ramona, that you have, and then we'll get into strategies.
Okay, some of these are strategy related. Let me see if there's one here. Amy asks, if there is a body of research that stretches back decades, why aren't inclusive philosophies the norm?
Why aren't they the norm? Why aren't they the norm? Okay.
Why are they not?
Good, valid question. And the answer to that is just the dominance of the micro paradigm. It is so dominant, it is so encompassing that it just engulfs people, and we still struggle for inclusion, right? And then you even add some of the political sort of stuff that's happening around us, where you get a pushback on inclusion, not wanting people included because they're different from me, different religion, different sexual orientation, different this, different that. And you get this pushback that actually had been, in a political way, has been validated, and broadcasted. So not only do we have the paradigm, the micro paradigm, that we can fix what's wrong and make it right, and rather than to say there is no wrong kid that has to be made right, there's kids, and if we create an inclusive culture, they'll sort this out, right? So I think that those are probably the two major factors: the dominance of the micro paradigm and the political rising of exclusion, of of literally the devaluing and the stereotyping of difference that we see is made fashionable again in our culture, unfortunately. So let's do this, Ramona. Let's hold on to some of those other questions or comments that we have, and let's get into some strategies. It sounds like people like, okay, Condeluci, you made your case. Tell me what I have to do. Okay, give me some ideas here. Okay, so let me do that. I don't have the answer, by the way. I don't have a magic wand. If I had a magic wand, I would have been out there with it years ago, right? But I do have some strategies that I think that I think position people to begin to be in a place of building social capital, right? And so let's look at that right now. Okay, so social capital theory is generic, right? It's not necessarily, this is not a disability strategy. This is a generic sort of agenda designed to help anyone build new relationships. For example, if anybody on this call would find that they had to move to a new community, to another place, another state, another country, because of their job or for whatever reason, they leave their social capital behind. Knowing how important it is to have social capital, how would they build relationships in this new place that they find themselves? What would you do, or what could you think about doing in order to begin to build relationships? So in that spirit, let me talk about this generally, and then we can focus in on, how this might happen in a school community, right? Or in, a venue that's structured, right? So first and foremost, relationships thrive on similarity, right? In fact, there's a simple relationship axiom: similarities attract, differences repel. Similarities attract, differences repel, right? So when we first find ourselves engaging with somebody new, anywhere, at a party, at a reception, wherever, however, the dance that we do is finding similarities. What's your name? Where are you from? What do you do? And how does that align with me, right? Where are you from? Yeah, okay. Where'd you go to school, right? All of these things are designed to find similarity, because every time we find a sense of similarity, we move a step closer in the bridging process to bonding, right? Now, there's bridging and there's bonding in terms of building social capital. Bridging is those first steps with new people that you get exposed to, however that exposure might be. And the bridging phase of building social capital is always paved in similarity. What do we have in common? What do we share? What do we both like, right? Because those elements create a general sense of attraction. Now, on the other side of the coin, differences repel. That if you meet a new person, say you're at a reception and you're starting to chat with somebody and you discover, gee, Manise, we went to the same college and we, did this and we did that. And you're discovering that each similarity is moving you a little closer to that person. And then all of a sudden they tell you something that essentially is 180 degrees different from you. They tell you their political beliefs, or they tell you something that is that you struggle with, that pushes you away, right? So in relationship building, finding similarities and affinities become the very first ingredient. Now, at the agency that I worked at for close to 50 years, we developed a cultural profile. And when we met somebody new that was referred to our agency, we didn't want to know about their disability or any of that. What we wanted to know about is, what do they like? What do they care about? What are they interested in? What do they like to do? What would they like to know more of? And discovering these affinities they did two things. The first thing they did was they validated the person, right? Because when the person talks about something they like, they feel good. They feel validated. They feel like you care about something they like or that they're interested in. So it's affirming, right? But the second thing it does is give you a ticket to think about in terms of step 2 in the engagement process. Okay. So through the cultural profile, we get to know what somebody likes and cares about. Step 2 is where in the community, and community could be the school, do people gather because they like the same thing? Where do people gather who like the same thing? Right now, this notion of mapping is a strategy that I teach to groups and organizations in terms of thinking about getting people more engaged in community. You got to know where people gather in community, right? Where are the places and spaces where people gather formally and informally, right, around things that they like, right? So this mapping strategy is step 2. Now, mapping, I would recommend to anybody on this call to think about mapping from not just the school perspective, but from the community perspective, right? If your son is interested in, I don't know, roller coasters, or I don't know, they're interested in video games or whatever they're really passionate about, then the second step is not just in the school do people gather around this, but where in the greater community do people gather around this particular interest area? Are there any clubs, groups, or associations that might be a match, right? Now, the community mapping process is one where you can actually, and schools have already done this, where a school will identify all the potential extracurricular activities that are possible for a student, right? And it's laid out, right? There's this club, there's the high Y, there's this group, there's that group, there's there's the tennis club, there's all these different things that are available at the school and in the school. Those are the formal things, right? But there's also informal groupings of people who cluster around other kinds of things for other kinds of reasons, right? So the second strategy is to really think about identifying a potential target where the ticket could be punched, right? So that's the second strategy, is mapping and discovering the possibilities. The third step then begins to focus in on the infrastructure of the target, right? So that if I want to, if I discover that my son likes to play chess, and I discover there's a chess club, not at the school, but at the boys' club, right? And so now step 3 is, what are the expected behaviors in that club? How do people behave? How do they dress? When do they go? What are some of the rituals? How do people pattern themselves? Where do they sit? Who do they sit with? That's all considered social infrastructure. Right? Now, there's been lots of stuff written about social infrastructure. A great book by Eric Kleinenberg called the Palaces for the People, right? Where he examines infrastructure stuff. But infrastructure is what's expected in the setting, right? And the coaching that might need to happen so that when the newcomer penetrates into the new setting, they fit in a bit more. They may not fit in perfectly, but they fit in a bit more. They have a little bit of what's expected of them. Now, understand this: once the community begins to accept the newcomer, the community will oftentimes flex some of the infrastructure aspects for the new person. So there's some flexibility in infrastructure for change, right? But on the the first steps of cultural penetration is you're going into an infrastructure that's already set, right? And before you can expect it to adjust or to broaden or to change a bit to accept, your son, that's not going to happen right off the bat until the person really begins to, get some value in that setting, right? And that leads us to the fourth strategy. And that strategy is the gatekeeper. Right? And I talked about this when we started the program tonight. And when we started talking about the gatekeeper, I talked about my grandfather's cousin Guido, who was his gatekeeper, right? He was already in a church here. So he played the role of facilitating that my grandfather get involved in the church. And he already had a job, and he helped my grandfather get a job. And so the gatekeeper is somebody already in the community. They're indigenous to the community. They're already in the club. They're already in the group. They're already in the neighborhood, whatever. And they create a passage for the newcomer. So here's an example of a gatekeeper. And by the way, everyone on this call has had multiple gatekeepers in your life. So think about, your job, your current job, or your last job. When you first started your job, who oriented you to the job? That's your gatekeeper. In your life, your mom and dad were your first gatekeepers in community, right? They brought you to church, they brought you to synagogue, they brought you here, they brought you there, and you got escorted by them into these venues, right? They were your gatekeepers. So the gatekeeper is somebody already established who welcomes in the newcomer to that setting, right? And therein, we go back to the best buddies thing. Therein lies, in some ways, some value of a program like Best Buddies, because the kid that's recruited to be a best buddy with somebody is already a member of this and a member of that, and active in this group and known in the school community. And when they're juxtaposed, the person that they're connected with, that person's value rises a bit. That's the social influence of value juxtaposition. So this gatekeeper is somebody already in the group, somebody who has some influence. Usually the gatekeeper is somebody who's usually open or receptive. They're willing to take some social risk. and they're viewed in positive ways by other people, right? These are things we know about gatekeepers, right? And so if you're looking for a gatekeeper to establish an introduction and let it unfold, this is the kind of person that you look for. And this is a strategy that we teach, especially to staff members, DSPs, who work in community-based agencies and are working with adults who have graduated from school, who are now out of the school community and just probably spending time at home. And then they get perhaps aligned with an agency. And so part of the building of social capital is really designed to help those DSPs find gatekeepers, because you can't be a gatekeeper for somebody that you care about in a community you're not a member of. You can't go in and say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Condeluci, and I'm a dauntless defender of disability, and this is my friend Bill, and he's really interested in what you're interested in, and won't you be his neighbor? Won't you like him? Right? I can't, I have no clout, right? So the gatekeeper has some influence, and that's really what we're looking for from a strategic point of view, right? So measuring social capital. If we start to use some of these strategies and begin to think, how do we, how might we begin to try to open things up and to get kids through what they're interested in, aligned with other kids who are interested in the same thing? And can we do some measuring, right? And there's some scales that are out there that look at social capital, and they look at community engagement. The social capital benchmarking survey I already talked about. That's the one we used in our study. And by the way, that study was written up in 2016 in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. But there's friendship scales, there's friendship questionnaires, there's a sociomatic interview and plotting. There's a scale called the know, like, do in, do out scale. This came out of the University of Cincinnati. So it really has kids identify who do they know. Out of the kids they know, who do they like? The kids that they like, who do they do things with in school? And out of the kids that they do things with, who do they do things with out of school, right? In the community in general sense. And so it discerns some of that. So there are some measuring that can happen. Because learning is a social process, right? Intended to prepare students for community living, for community success, right? This notion of thinking about what's the reason for education, right? And it's really to see kids successful in the greater community. So here's some things teachers can do, some strategies, and I think we have some teachers on the call. Now, obviously teachers do these, but identify similarities between students. And I can't stress that enough, because similarities is the elixir, the first elixir to relationships. Create the possibilities for social interactions between peers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we did out of in Pittsburgh a couple years back that used this strategy. So these are some things teachers can do. And in the classroom, it's possible to really begin to incorporate successful stories and profiles of folks with disabilities, right? Using films and videos, and essentially identifying activities that kids could do, maybe even together, in terms of writing a story or doing some research or searching the internet as it relates to inclusive kinds of issues and things. So there's some books and videos that are out there. In fact, I just found a really interesting, it's not on this slide, but there's an entire lesson plan developed utilizing the life of Judy Heumann in schools. Judy Heumann is just passed away, disability advocate, unfortunately passed away, who sued the city of New York's school system. She wanted to be a teacher. She happened to use a wheelchair. She had a post-polio situation. And they wouldn't give her a teaching certificate because they said she was a fire hazard. And this was in 1972. And Judy sued the New York City school district to have an opportunity to be a teacher. And she won. And she was a successful teacher for a number of years and then went on to a very illustrative career as an advocate. And there's an entire lesson plan that's been developed about Judy's life. That's really cool. I'll see if I can get that resource to Ramona. So this notion of social academics is really the social process of building activities in a lesson plan that prepare students to engage. Now, I know that a lot of teachers do this already, and that's great, but the notion of having kids engaged and creating more opportunity for this kind of activity so that education isn't this solo process where you take a test and you write a paper and you get your grade and you're competing with all these other kids for grades, but that education is much more of a cooperative process where literally kids do things together. So this idea of classrooms as communities is another strategy where a classroom can actually be encouraged to create these cooperative groupings with kids so that they function more like a community than like kids that hold their cards close to the vest. And classrooms as communities use community building activities, the getting to know you activities, encourage participation in extracurricular things that might go on in the class, get kids to maybe work on an assignment after school together, involve family members in some of this. All of that can be part of creating a milieu, creating a culture that the classroom is a community. And we did a project in Pittsburgh in 27, 8, and 9. We got funding from the Heinz Foundation in Pittsburgh, and we basically did 5 pilot classrooms where we had teachers willing to build classroom strategies, and we worked together with them. So this notion of this teacher project, there's some information that I have available on that if folks are interested in wanting to know a little bit more about it. It ended in 2009, that's a while back, because the funding. And unfortunately, school districts are often strapped for funding, and so innovative things get tabled or get edited out because of funding initiatives. So that's a whole other conversation, by the way, that we don't have time for tonight. So let me just finish this up and then open it up to questions. There's stuff out there, there's books out there, and there's resources. We have the whole internet right at our fingertips in terms of looking at novel kinds of things, or seeing if we can find some stuff on the edges and bring that into our, I talked about blue zones. What are the lessons from the blue zones, and are there some things we can actually incorporate that would promote more inclusivity in our schools and in our classrooms? So let me finish this up with a little parable. And I found this parable in a book by Margaret Wheatley, and the parable was, the book is called "Conversations Can Change the World," right? And it's a wonderful book. It's full of examples and possibilities related to just talking about something. And this goes like this, very short. It's called An Aztec Story. A long time ago, there was a great fire in the forest that covered our earth. People and animals started to run, trying to escape from the fire. Our brother Owl, Tocatl, was running away also when he noticed a small bird hurrying back and forth between the nearest river and the fire. He headed toward that small bird. He noticed that it was our brother, the Quetzal bird, running to the river, picking up little drops of water in his beak, returning to the fire, throwing that tiny bit of water onto the flame. The owl approached the Quetzal bird and he yelled at him. He said, "What are you doing, brother? Are you crazy? You're not going to achieve anything by this. You're too small. You must run for your life." The Quetzal bird stopped for a moment, looked at the owl, and he answered, "I'm doing the best I can with what I have to save a place that I love." It is remembered by our grandparents that a long time ago, the forests that covered our earth were saved from a small fire by a small little Quetzal bird and an owl and many other animals and people that got together to put out the flame. It's a beautiful little parable of modeling, of social influence, of synergy, of the fact that no one of us is going to create inclusion, right? Not just one of us. It's really going to take all of us doing our small little part, wherever we find it, however we find it, to create that community where everybody belongs. And so here's some contact information on me. I'm going to stop sharing now. We have about 15 minutes or so for some final questions. But here's some way, if we don't get to answer your question, or if I said anything that you'd like to talk to me about or would like to, engage with me more, I'm happy to do that. And I told Ramona and Sandy when we were setting this up that I'm happy to do that. Here's some contact information for me, including, my phone number and my email address, and also my website. If you go to my website, I have some videos on social capital and on inclusivity. A TED Talk, I did a TED Talk on social capital a couple of years ago that's also uploaded on the website. And, I hope that some of the things we talked about tonight might give you, if there's just one thing you take away and feel maybe you can begin to apply it, then I'm happy about that. And if I can be of any further help to you, here's how you can contact me. But right now I'm going to stop sharing so we can go back to a matrix, and then Ramona or Ann can get into, or Lynn can get into the chat room. And if there's any questions, we can go from there. So let me stop sharing. Great, good. Ramona, let me ask if you can pull some things out of the chat room so we can examine maybe some things that people are thinking.
Okay, yes, we have a few good ones here. Definitely, we have more than a few. We probably won't get to them all.
That's
and
okay.
There's been some great comments in the chat. So anyone who's watching the chat, keep an eye on that. People have also shared some resources.
Great.
So here's the first question. Do you have any specific recommendations on how to get a school administration and community to embrace social capital, especially when we have a lot of people who are adamantly against diversity and inclusion?
Yeah.
Just those two words are triggering in our climate. How can we bring both sides together to see the benefit of this?
Yeah. The only thing I could say about that, and I think that, it's such a good point. It's a very powerful point, because you're right. Culturally, unfortunately, we're making diversity, or not, we're making it. People are making diversity a bad word, right? And that's tragic. So I think to that issue, my sense is make sure you vote for people who, are informed and recognize that things change and trends are happening. People aren't for inclusion until they have a personal situation that happens in their lives. And so I think we want to have elected officials who I think represent all of us. But having said that, the other thing I think we can do is, rather than talk about social capital from a diversity perspective, I think we talk about social capital from a life success perspective for all students, right? And this really gets back to this blue zone stuff that I was talking about earlier, because when we look at, what are the things that lead to life success, right? There's a research strategy that's called positive deviance, and it was developed at Brandeis University in the 90s. And positive deviance is really a cool research strategy. And what it says is, if you have something that you're concerned about, the best way to study that is to find people who have been successful in the area that you are concerned about, and then see what they do, right? That's called positive deviance. It's finding outliers who have been successful. And that's exactly what the Blue Zone strategy has done. The Blue Zone strategy says that people are interested in health, happiness, and longevity. Health, happiness, and longevity. These are the three things that people want. So where are people healthy, happy, and living longer, right? And that led to that agenda led to finding the blue zones. And then once the blue zones were found, we begin to say, what are these guys doing here in Loma Linda? Or what are these guys doing in Nicoya, Costa Rica, or in Okinawa, that they're living 7, 8, 10 years past the benchmark of life expectancy? And they're doing it with less medical, involvement and less hospitalizations. And why? Why are they more successful? What is it? What's their secret, right? So I think if we position social capital not as a diversity strategy or an inclusion strategy, but as a life success strategy for all students, right? Then maybe folks won't be so fearful, right? Maybe they won't think that, this is woke and, or this is, some, political agenda, that they'll see the benefit for their own child, and they'll see the benefit for all the children. So that would be my record. Just couch it in a life success strategy, and then maybe we'll get better attention or more attention. Thanks for the point. Ramona, what else?
Next question kind of dials in on a specific community. It says, wondering if there are specific strategies that are most effective for those with autism. Apparently this person has an autistic son and says that he's in an activity every day of the week, but has very few relationships.
Right. That, well, let me say first about that. That's a great point. Thank you for whoever raised it. Let me say first that relationships and friendships and the value of friendships don't have to be 50-50. In fact, most relationships are not 50-50. When we hear the word relationship, we think 50-50, but 50-50 doesn't exist. And everybody on this call knows that there's sometimes more you give, and sometimes there's more you get, and more times when you give and more times when you get. And so relationships are fluid, right? They're dynamic. And so someone who is, more socially uncomfortable, which oftentimes, sometimes folks that are on the spectrum might be socially uncomfortable. I just spoke today at a conference in Pittsburgh, and during the break, one of the attendees came up to me, and I was talking about micro and macro change and about community building, and she was really jazzed by this. And she said, I'm getting a lot out of this. She said, but people don't know that I have a disability because they can't see it. And but I'm on the spectrum. And as she was talking to me, she kept on backing away, and I was getting closer because I don't hear so well anymore. And I wanted to make sure that I could hear what she was saying to me. So I was getting closer, and she was backing away. And so there's some reality that some people have where they just don't want to be close. And that is fine. That there's nothing wrong with that. But in a relationship, when people begin to get valued, then other people will understand that. You just don't get too close to Kim. She's just uncomfortable with that. That's because we know Kim, right? And we know and we value Kim, and so we're just not going to get so close. But the last thing I want to say on that question, and recommend that the person who asked the question maybe take a look at this. I don't know if you've seen the book Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. Neurotribes is the title of the book, Neurotribes. And this is a phenomenal book that any advocate that's interested in autism spectrum inclusion ought to take a good look at, because there's some really kind of interesting recommendations that Silberman makes. It's probably the most definitive book I've ever seen on autism and Asperger's and other aspects of autism spectrum realities. So take a look at that. The book is called Neurotribes. Next question, Ramon.
Okay, this is flipping to the neurotypical people, and how do we help them learn to be flexible thinkers?
Yeah.
They say neurotypical people can have a disability that manifests as having a very narrow expectation and acceptance of what is normal. So
Yes.
if you're normal, you don't stim, you do
Right.
make contact, you don't take several seconds to answer a question, you don't make unexpected statements. So how do we help the NTs learn to be more flexible thinkers?
Yeah, that's great. And I bet that person probably has read Neurotribes, who raised that question, or maybe has seen the book, because the focus, macro change focus from autism advocacy is getting changes in the neurotypical people, right? And lighting and loud sounds and other kinds of things that are just the norm in a neurotypical world need adjustment. And so the notion of macro change, how do we get people to be willing to broaden? And this gets back to that notion of relationships, right? The more that people who are neurodiverse get into the mix and become known, the more neurotypical people will begin to behave in neurosensitive ways, right? That will only happen that way. It's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to make it legislatively. We're going to have to do that through relationships. And that requires that some people as advocates are willing to take that step into a neurotypical world as a advocate. It's no different in the civil rights era when we were fighting for racial justice, right? And those advocates walked across the Selma Bridge. They knew that when they got to the other side of the bridge, people were waiting with clubs over there. They knew that was going to happen. And it did happen. And it's a sordid part of our history as a country. But there's gotta be some courage in making steps into the world as it is in an effort to change the world to the way we'd like it to be, right? We got to do that. And there's some uncomfortableness in this, no question. And there's going to be some moments that people are going to really feel maybe, unwelcomed, and other kinds of things might happen there. But that's a part, you got to get in the mix, and you got to start building relationships. I wish there was a elixir or a potion. There isn't. The only way we're going to change the world is legislatively and relationship wise. Those are the two tracks to changing the world. Thank you, though, for the point. Great point.
I'm hoping you have time for one more question.
Sure, I do.
As you've gone through your presentation, it seems like the gatekeepers really hold the key to breaking down the barriers.
Yes, they do.
How do we enlist, find, identify more gatekeepers? How do we get those who are natural gatekeepers to embrace those who want to be included?
Yeah.
And how do we guide and coach them, creating a culture where gatekeepers feel supported and encouraged? Like, how it seems like the magic is in the gatekeeper.
Yes, it is. There's absolutely, I mean, that you got it. The gatekeeper is the first point of contact in the world we want to change, right? And the gatekeeper escorts the newcomer into that world and then validates them, okay? So the gatekeeper themselves don't have to make the change. What the gatekeeper does is makes the agenda for change viable in the eyes of the other players in that community. That's why finding somebody who's influential is important, right? To play that role as the gatekeeper. And I often tell the story when I'm doing training of efforts we made with my cousin Carrie to get her more included. And one of the things that I was just developing this theory when I was working with Carrie. Carrie has since passed away, but when those 4 steps that I outlined. Number 1, we sat down with Carrie. What does she really like, right? And Carrie has a lot of interests. One of the things she liked was photography. Step 2, is there a photography club in Pittsburgh? Can we find a photography gathering point, right? And so I did. I found a camera club, right, that met in Oakland, our university area. Ramona, you have a child at Pitt. So I found this camera club, and they met at the Pitt Tavern, which was a little community tavern right in Oakland by the university. They met there the first Tuesday of every month. So I went to the Pitt Tavern because I wanted to observe what they did at this camera club before I took my cousin. But mostly I was there to look for a gatekeeper, right? Because the only way that I could get my cousin into that club was to introduce her to some member of that club who then could escort her into the club, right? I mean, I couldn't take her into the club and say, hey, I want to sign up my cousin. She has Down syndrome, but she's a great woman. You're going to like her. Yeah, that wouldn't work, right? That's crazy. So I was searching for a gatekeeper, right? And through observation, I found this woman who she was. The 2 times I went to observe before I brought Carrie, she was smiling a lot. Everybody knew her. She seemed so engaging. She was one of those people that if you walked into a setting, you would want to know her. Right? Don't you know people like that are attractive, socially attractive, that you just want to get next to them, right? So I approached her, introduced myself, and I told her that my cousin was interested in photography. She's never been in a club like this before. If I brought her over, would she introduce her to the other members? And guess what she said? Yes, of course. I knew she'd say yes because I profiled her, right? So if you think about gatekeepers, you can literally find them, they're there. They have an aura, a green aura. If you're a new age person, you know about the green and the red auras. This is a green aura that gatekeepers have. They are approachable. They're people, they're people who make a difference and want to make a difference. Ramona was my gatekeeper tonight, right? She introduced me to you. And Ramona from her work and her passion with the SEA. So she validated me. Before you even heard one word out of my mouth, you were willing to listen because Ramona invited me. That's why. Not because of any great thing I've done. It's because somebody who's valued in your own world validated me. Right? That's how the gatekeeper works.
Okay, well, I feel like I just won the social capital lottery here.
Well, maybe if people were interested down the road, Ramona, we can do a follow-up that focuses just in on this, on this one sort of thing. And we can use some examples. We could have people talk, make it very interactive. So think about that. But I know that we're out of time and you guys are already, it's 9 o'clock and a little after 9. I hear my dog downstairs barking her head off as my wife went to a reception. Our niece was in a reception tonight at a play at the school, and my wife went there. So my dog is barking her full head off downstairs. So I'm going to have to go down and see what damage she's done downstairs. But I want to thank Ramona and Sandy and all the folks in the SEA for this invitation tonight. But mostly I want to thank you. If you're still with us, if you're still hanging in there, thanks so much for plugging in. If you have any further questions, please feel free. Just reach out. Remind me though that you were at this thing, so I can have a context that I can get right back to you with. Okay. Other than that, Ramona, thank you so much. Good luck in what you do. This is not easy stuff, but just talking about it moves us closer to reality.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, sharing your experience and knowledge on the value of social capital. I think that I really enjoyed, especially the Q&A portions where we could really discuss and dig a little deeper. So for our audience members, we will send out a copy for those of you who are registered, a copy of tonight's presentation, along with a white paper on social capital that Dr. Condeluci has generously shared with us. He also shared a lot of books and resources as we kind of went through the presentation. So I'm hoping my partners here were able to note a lot of those down. We'll get those out to you as well. And as soon as it's available, we'll send you a link to the recording. So thank you all again and good night. Thanks, Dr. Condeluci.
Have a great day. Bye now.